and tonight's lecture is part of Critical Conversations programming, which is a collaboration between the University of Oregon and the Ford Family Foundation. The Ford Family Foundation's Visual Arts program honors the foundation's late co-founder, Haley Ford, and her lifelong interest in the arts by helping Oregon's most promising visual artists actively pursue their practice. The work of Critical Conversations is formed between publications, convening, and the Curator and Critics Tour. Critical Conversations is in tandem with partners across the state, facilitates a year-round calendar of studio visits for Oregon artists by 3 prominent visiting curators or critics who also deliver public lectures and engage artists, curators, and writers around currents in the field and the larger society. As you can imagine, the vision of Haley Ford and the continuation of this type of support from the Ford Family Foundation is an extremely generous gift to artists and cultural producers in the state of Oregon. I want to take a moment to thank Meg Onli, the Senior Advisor for the Ford Family Foundation's Visual Arts Program, Laura Hughes for her role as a Critical Conversations Program Coordinator, Wendy Heldman for her role as CFAR's Program Manager, and our department leadership, faculty, and participating artists for making this program a success. Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce curator Meg Onli, the Nancy and Fred Posey's curator at Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. Onli is a distinguished curator whose practice begins with careful observation and deep engagement with overlooked and underrepresented histories. Her theoretically rich and materially engaged exhibitions frequently bring together artists, theorists, and writers to create relational projects that engage archives, lived experiences, and cultural memory. A defining aspect of her approach is a critical examination of the institution and the curatorial role, not only as sites of presentation, but also as spaces for collective reimagining, where new forms of knowledge production can emerge. Aside from her current post at the Whitney, Onli has worked as the Andrea B. Laporte Associate Curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, and as Director and Curator of the Underground Museum in Los Angeles. She has also curated such exhibitions as Speech Acts 2017, Colored People Time, Mundane Features, Quotidian Pasts, Banal Presence in 2019, and Ulysses, Jenkins, Without Your Interpretation 2021, with Erin Christovale. In 2024, she was appointed to curate the Whitney Biennial alongside Chrissie, Iles. Please join me in welcoming Meg Onli.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me well? All right. Let me just pull up a chair really quick. Tanaz, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I forget that I do all those things. I often find myself to be like an arranger of objects, and so it's lovely to be places where I feel very seen. I also want to give a huge thank you to the Critical Conversations program, including Tanaz, Laura, and Wendy, and all the artists. I see a lot of you here, and art historians who have spent some time with me over the past couple days. I feel like it's such a privilege to be able to land in a city and be ushered around by such talented and smart people, and so I really thank you all for having me. Before I get into this, I just have a quick question, like how many people are artists in the audience? Okay, majority. Art historians, curators? Yeah, holding strong, guys. Appreciate it. I am going to talk a bit about my practice, and it's going to be, as I said, notes, kind of, thoughts that I've had, how I got to where I am now, and the fact, maybe to begin by saying that I actually studied first as an artist at an art school, and so that has had a really great influence on me, how I relate to artists, how I begin my projects with artists. And as I've said to many of you in studio visits, I just have a deep admiration for what it means to be making something, to wake up in the day and want to make something and express something. I was really not good at it, and I felt like through being around other artists, it allowed me to kind of figure out where I wanted to situate myself, and I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of finding that path. And also I thought, I'm very casual and I'm very conversational, and I love talking. And so I will try and keep this as focused as possible. But if you have a question while I'm talking and you're like, Meg, I don't know what that thing is, you can interrupt me. I'm totally fine with that. I just want to make sure that people are following. And I do want to do a little bit of time, I think, when I meet with people at universities and I meet with artists, there is this kind of like, I don't know, like unmasking of what the Whitney Biennial is. It's such a weird project. And once you get in it, you realize like, it's even weirder. Like there's no way to have it be really standardized, even though there are some things that you follow. It's not like I report it to anyone. And so I'm happy to kind of talk about that project in like a really loose way. And instead of about each artist and artist practice, I'm going to talk a lot about like, how did I and Chrissie make decisions kind of around that? And I'll also talk about like career development aspect of like, how did I move from one place to the other? And so I'm going to begin with 3 shows that were deeply important to me when I was in art school. So I went to art school in Chicago at the School of Art Institute of Chicago. Chicago? Yeah. SCIC too. Oh, nice. SCIC is like this. What do you say? We're back. We're back. So as I mentioned, I went to undergrad, and I often say a few things really happened to me at the start of when I started undergrad, which was the artist Martine Sims lived in the dorms with me, who's a very close friend. I've been thinking about her work, and I'll mention her later on. And I realized really soon on that there were certain artists that were just producing at this level that I could not really fathom, but I was really interested in being in conversation with them. And then I also had a chance to meet a very important curator, Marcia Tucker. Marcia Tucker was one of the founders of the New Museum. She famously got fired from the Whitney Museum for showing a Richard Tuttle show. Controversy in the 1970s. But another curator I met was Hamza Walker. And early on, I had a chance to see this exhibition, Black Is, Black Ain't, which was a really seminal exhibition for me. And Hamza Walker, if you don't know him, he runs the space, The Brick. He's about to open what will probably be a very controversial show about monuments. He was a person that really introduced me to curatorial thought as being any interest that you're interested in. We talked about comic books. We talked about Black Flag, we talked about living in Redondo Beach. We had all these ways of just sort of engaging around ideas and talking about art that it made me realize, oh, a curator could actually be a person who isn't just obsessed with art history and is like really interested in different narratives and how you bring those together in the space. But also importantly about Black Is, Black Ain't, it's an exhibition that brought together both Black and non-Black artists whose work collectively examined a moment, and this is like pre-Obama, this is like right before Obama gets elected, where the cultural production of so-called Blackness is concurrent with efforts to make race socially and politically irrelevant. And so already to begin, there is this real tension around the political aim of the exhibition, and it's not clearly this like, here's a Black art show. This is simply about celebrating African-American artists, and how do you sort of trouble some of those narratives when you're working with artists of specific identities who have been overlooked. And so this was an early model to me, and I'd say my first couple shows, I returned to this catalog. I returned to Thelma Golden's Post-Black Frequency catalog a lot, just to think about where curatorial ideas could take shape, and that sometimes you'll kind of see in my practice, I'm not interested in really big things. I'm interested in really small ideas executed well. And so this was a model for me. I also am a huge fan of Helen Molesworth. I'm very thankful. It feels like, at least in the curatorial space, there's very few queer people and lesbians, and Helen has really taken me under her wing. I was a huge fan of her exhibition, This Will Have Been, that I saw in 2012. I had a chance to see Helen give a tour of this exhibition. If you ever have a chance to listen to Helen talk, I could listen to her forever. She's incredibly casual and brilliant and an encyclopedia. And as you'll kind of see, I do want to kind of point out within this show, which was a huge survey of rethinking the 1980s and how does one sort of approach a decade that had really been seen as the entree into the marketplace. And you have these kind of dueling things between someone, let's say like Jeff Koons, who is making work that is clearly thinking about capital. And then you have on the other end, the pictures generation, who are thinking a lot about post-structuralist theory and thought. And so those things are really interesting to me. I still think about the pictures generation. I think a lot about the October School. But Helen was a person that was tying these things together. And I just want to, mention, this general idea wallpaper that's here to also think about like bold installations, things that are sort of world building. I think a lot about aesthetic gestures. I was talking earlier this morning about the idea of a gesture not always being about painting. And so how do you think about these ideas of gestures when you're in a curatorial space or when you're thinking as an artist? And then the last show I just want to shout out is just an incredibly important exhibition to me. It's a show called Now Dig This, which was curated by Kelly Jones. Kelly Jones is an amazing art historian. She's done a lot of work around bringing visibility to practices like David Hammond, Senga Noguchi, Marin Hassinger, Suzanne Jackson, Ulysses Jenkins. And Now Dig This, I remember coming out of art school, I was like $40,000 in debt, and I was really pissed off that I had no idea what this history was that she was talking about. And it was based in Los Angeles, where I was from, and I just was like, oh, a curator can actually uncover some of these histories and really like show people a different way of thinking. And so Kelly is also one of my close mentors, and I'm just deeply thankful for the work of orchestrating and showing artists in that type of way that is also really thoughtful and not about reducing an artist practice. And so I just want to give shout out to 3 shows that like deeply inspired me before I made my first exhibition. And so I always identify as a late bloomer. I took a really long time to go to college. I took a really long time to figure out what I wanted to do. And by the time I was 30-ish, I went to graduate school, and I went to graduate school at the Courtauld in London. It's like an art history conservatory. I studied with Mignon Nixon, and I was saying early in our studio visit today, I realized how much of my art historical background is actually being trained through feminist theories. I studied with Faith Wilding. Mignon Nixon is a huge feminist theorist. Thought a lot about psychoanalysis from someone like Juliet Mitchell. All of this stuff is like, I'm interested in theory. I'm married to a philosopher. Like a lot of these things kind of come up in my work. But it made me realize like this is the training that I've had. And when I came out of graduate school, it sounds weird to say I like met someone. I met a person who was like, hey, you're interesting. Maybe you want to apply for this job. And I applied for a job at the ICA in Philadelphia. It's a storied institution. It's where, if you know of Robert Mapplethorpe being canceled, everything that happened with the NEA, that show originated A Perfect Moment from the ICA. When I was at the ICA, the endowment that we had is actually from Agnes Martin. It was a gift from Agnes Martin because she felt seen by the institution. She said it couldn't be released until after her death, but that her first major show with Gagosian, she saved that money and gave it as an endowment to the institution. And so this is an institution that has a deep tie to artists. And that's not to say that I don't ever disagree with the way that they've shown artists or histories around that, but really interesting kind of the way that they've championed artists. And so when I got there, I thought I was going to be doing this tiny little project space, and our chief curator at the time, Anthony Elms, said, I really want you to think of this like bigger show, like 4,000 square feet, which is maybe like 4 of these rooms. And I was really scared, and I was like, I'm not really sure what to do. And I thought about different ideas, and I came up with an exhibition called Speech Acts. And Speech Acts was, kind of looking back to Searle's theory of language and thinking about the ways in which language can perform an action. But what I really came back to was the fact that a lot of shows at the time, I think there'd been a big language art show at MoMA, there had been a big one at the Getty, and one of the things that I'm interested in personally is like the pivot. How do you sort of think about what is happening right now and you point to something else and say, oh, you guys are really interested in language arts, but why is Glenn Ligon and Adam Pendleton the only Black artists that you're showing within this? And that poetry, experimental poetry, is like incredibly Black. And so I looked to a group of contemporary artists, including, this is an installation of Martine Sims, that you're seeing her work lessons, and brought them together in this show. And so it was Ajibade Klill-Huffman, Stephanie Jamison, Tony Lewis, Tiana Nakia McLauden, Camila Janan Rashid, and Martine Sims. And a lot of them were thinking about different ideas of, experimental poetry, where language fails to name an identity. The work itself all kind of stood on its own. It wasn't about having this monolithic idea of what Blackness or Black experimental poetry necessarily was. And one thing I want to point out, this is the first room that you enter into, and Martine is often working with these kind of large graphic identity, and what you're seeing is lightly, slightly, politely, and that was taken from an interview with Carrie Mae Weems, Oregon, and she said something like, you know, what is it about her generation of artists, her, Lorna Simpson, Carrie James Marshall, that have made them famous? And she says, we're all light, slight, and polite. And so I was really thinking about how you bring some of that in generationally. How do you have a little bit of tooth? I like having a little bit of tooth to my exhibitions. And all of these artists were like, you know, my generation of thinkers. And in my first show, when it opened, this is gonna sound like a humble brag, but it's gonna lead someplace. Before it opened, it got written up in the New York Times, and so it produced tons of anxiety for myself before the show happened. And then during the show, Tiana Nakia McLaughlin's work gets acquired by MoMA. So I suddenly just have this really different profile after doing an exhibition. And from doing that, I then start thinking, oh God, I don't know how I did this. I'm not really sure if I'm like, I don't want to say like worthy of curating, but like I couldn't figure out like how to reorient myself. And so I gave myself restrictions and really thinking about kind of, you know, constraints. And I think one of the things I'm really interested in curating is that inherently you have constraints. Even being at the Whitney, I have constraints. There's lots of constraints that you run into, either from legal places, you run into constraints versus what artists want to produce. Does the language speak to a general audience? There's all these things that you're kind of constantly negotiating. And so I curated this exhibition called Colored People Time, and it was a processional show, 3 exhibitions across the year of 2019. And they are thinking in temporal disorder. And so it begins with a project called Mundane Futures, which you're seeing here. It then goes to Quotidian Past and Banal Presence. And all of this project really came out of having conversations with artists and speech acts. It's about 750 square feet. I wanted to think about an exhibition as like think tank. I also was on the campus of University of Pennsylvania. Okay, I want to make sure my wife texting me isn't showing up here. And I really wanted to think about how visual culture kind of plays into these conversations of artists. And so I'll say really quickly just kind of about this show. You're seeing Aria Dean, her notes on Black accelerationist theory. For me, thinking about Colored People Time, some artists would say to me, well, your show doesn't have any artists talking about Colored People Time. And I was like, yeah, it doesn't. Like, no one is actually talking about the idea of Colored People Time. And if people don't know what CPT is, it's this kind of amazing, I can see the people of color being like, yes, of course. It's this amazing theoretical, it's like, it's a theory and it's a performance at the exact same time. And it's saying, I am not going to move at the same time of Western time. Capitalism is not going to control me in this type of way. And of course, doing an exhibition called Colored People Time has its challenges. I spent a lot of time calling organizers in Philadelphia, just saying like, are you guys cool with this? Can you vouch for this? I don't want it to feel as if like a white curator is here using this in this certain way. But I also really wanted, like when I wrote my labels at ICA, like I knew who my audience was. I was writing directly for them. And so I only had one person call me ever during that run of the show. It was a nurse. And she was like, oh, you're Black? It's totally cool. She was like, I'm gonna come over and see the show. It was so just like opening to people. And when I started working on this show, I was really engaging with the work of Saidiya Hartman. And so Saidiya came in and saw the show, as well as Tina Campt. And so the idea of futurity, I think one of my formulations was the inherent act of being Black is about producing a time that has never been. And so it really thinks about this idea of, let's say, from slavery onwards, of building and thinking of anew, coming from a place of being considered an object and property into humanness. What you're seeing here of this publication is from Sutney Griggs, who was considered the first Afrofuturist writer. It's from 1899, and it's a work called Imperium and Imperio, and it's his imagination of what a Black exodus would be. The book's kind of wild, and I recommend reading it, but it's actually about them resettling on the territory between Mexico and Texas and totally moving out any indigenous population at the time. And so it's thinking about how do you then perpetuate these ideas of imperialism? So I'm really interested in like, where was failure in these practices? Where are artists imagining these things, and where are the complications that arise? And I often say, like, I want to make exhibitions where artists make and unmake each other. It's not about one position, it's about complicating it. And I clearly love this show. I need to stop talking about it so I can keep moving on, but I want to talk about one more thing. In this show, which you cannot see, I was really struggling with how do you kind of end a show, or you have so few pieces to focus on? And when I started making my shows, I actually worked with PhD students in the English department at UPenn, because I realized I just didn't have the precision of language, and I really wanted to have a thought partner. And so I thought of them as like dramaturgs or editors of my practices. And while we were thinking about this show, we had one more work, and we ended up purchasing from Getty Images the image of Henrietta Lacks's HeLa cells. And if you're familiar with Henrietta Lacks, she was a Black woman whose cancer cells have been used for many, many things, including in vitro fertilization, cloning, many different mRNA vaccines. And so I was thinking, the actual physicality of that is a Black woman that has been used, and you can actually buy them online. You can buy those cells that are out in the world, but the image that we used was actually a cell dividing. And so just thinking about that type of idea of in perpetuity. And so this was really like a super focused exhibition for me. It also featured, I do want to say really quick about it, it featured some artists that I just am really near and dear to my heart, which are Aria Dean, Kevin Jerome Everson, Matthew Angelo Harrison, Carolyn Lazard, who's a really close collaborator of mine, Dave McKenzie, Martine Sims, Sabo Lee Smith, and Cameron Rolland. And so all of those artists were just incredibly supportive in coming in. And I moved then on to thinking about, you know, I've done these really kind of like focused exhibitions. How do I focus on an artist who was overlooked? And so Erin Christovale and I at the Hammer focused on the work of Ulysses Jenkins. He's considered one of the first Black video artists. He was a collaborator with Senga Nagudi, Merritt Hassinger, David Hammonds. He studied with Charles White. He's collaborated with Kerry James Marshall. And until we did a show with him, he had never had a museum exhibition. And so we did a full survey of his work. It showed at ICA as well as the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. I call this our love letter to Kelly Jones. It really came out of Kelly's work on Now Dig This. She's not a video person. I'm really interested in video. So how do you sort of pick up the torch from another person and put the time in with this artist? And Ulysses, it was a real act of love. It was 3 years of focusing on his archives. Until he had seen this exhibition, he had never seen his work projected before. You know, it really like broke my heart. Like he had never seen his work projected. And I just think if he had, what could he have made? But he was just a really interesting artist, and I really recommend that you look him up. A lot of his stuff is available online, but he's thinking about art and technology in the 1980s. He picks up the Portapak camera when it becomes available in the late 1970s. And I would say he's deeply invested in, I don't think he would say this, in the music video before MTV. And so a lot of things that he's making are inherently music videos. So that's my career prior to being at the Whitney and prior to being at the Whitney Biennial. To say I dreamt of doing the Whitney Biennial. I wanted to do it so bad. And every year I was like, God, I really hope I get a phone call to do the Whitney Biennial. And when I got called, I was actually unemployed. I had gone to the Underground Museum in Los Angeles. The museum ended up folding after maybe like 3 months of me being there. And so I was unemployed and visiting my family, and I was talking to my best friend, and I could see a text come in from Chrissie Iles, who's a curator at the Whitney. And I met Chrissie during my very first show of Speech Act. She had written it up for Art in America. And so one day I saw her and I just said, you know, really, thank you, I appreciate it. And we started a long dialogue with each other, and leading into Ulysses, I asked her, she's a very famous video art curator, and I just said, you know, how does one present video that doesn't look good, blown up, when it's the most important artwork? So like this is going back to like CRT monitors, and for months, Chrissie and I had a standing meeting every Friday to talk about video for like 1 to 2 hours, and I learned so much from her, and I continue to learn a lot from her. And so she texted me and she was like, hey, are you free? And I told my best friend, I was like, I think I'm gonna be asked to do the Whitney Biennial. And I hung up, and Chrissie was like, hey, do you wanna do the Whitney Biennial with me? And I was like, yes, absolutely, I'd love to do this. I've dreamt of doing this, and I had been studying the Whitney Biennial for some time. And this isn't to say I'm like incredibly lucky. I think there's like connections, knowing people, all of those things, but I am also kind of lucky at the same time. And so the first thing I did was I jumped in and read every Whitney Biennial catalog. It begins in 1932 as an annual from Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. This is the very first Whitney annual that you're seeing, and this is in Gertrude's home. Gertrude was an artist and philanthropist. Her early collection is the founding of the Whitney, so like Hopper, things like that, we still have and are currently on view. I actually love this image. It's so cool to see work in like domestic spaces. And so I went from kind of looking at these early annuals, it becomes a biennial in 1973. That's the introduction of video and moving image art in 1973. And I would say the Whitney early on was this real testament to an artist's market stability. You know, if you were in multiple biennials or multiple annuals, it meant that you had a really strong career. So you might see someone like Roy Lichtenstein be in 8 or 9 times. You might see Hopper a ton of different times. That is not the case today. And so we do not necessarily always repeat artists. There's these kind of like weird things that have happened with the biennial. But I just want to say like the way that it overdetermined marketplace really influenced some structure of it, making it very secretive. And I really think in the 1990s, it actually becomes a really huge shift. And so if you know anything about the Whitney Biennial, you probably know the 1993 Whitney Biennial. It was co-curated with Thelma Golden. And when you think of the Whitney Biennial, you really think of this exhibition. And to me, it becomes the shift where the Whitney Biennial is actually about cementing the discourse in contemporary American art for that moment. And I think you see that anywhere from the controversial Dana Schutz painting really launches what those conversations are. I think most of them, and I feel like ours included, really kind of cements where a conversation is. And it's interesting because New York is so provincial, like no one thinks about it as like being as insular as it is. And oftentimes, you know, people have lots of strong feelings about what the biennial is, and critics will say, oh, this isn't what art is right now. And it's like, dude, you just travel across the country for a year and figure out what art is right now? Typically, no. And so you often have this kind of friction between what people are expecting a biennial to be versus like what it ends up being. And I just want to say really quick on the 93 biennial that I work with a curator who's in her late 80s who worked on the Whitney Biennial, and she still curates with us, Elizabeth Sussman, who I absolutely love. And so you get to have these amazing intergenerational conversations. I'm one of the youngest curators at the Whitney right now. And so that institutional knowledge just kind of continues to be part of the institution, which I like greatly appreciate. And so maybe I haven't fully defined. The Whitney Biennial is an exhibition that occurs every 2 years, and it kind of gives a task to the curators to travel wherever they want. There's no definition of like where you have to be, how much money you have to spend on your travel, and where you have to go. You can determine all of that yourself, what your travel schedule is. And every time it feels like people are remaking what that is. And so 2000s did an online survey. There's different ways that you can kind of approach it. My co-curator, Chrissie, Iles, and I decided this is Chrissie's 3rd biennial. It's not uncommon for artists or for curators to curate multiple biennials. We decided we wanted to travel to lots of places. I did 100 flights that year. I was afraid of flying before I did the Whitney Biennial, and now I'm like really good with flying. We did 100 flights. We did 200 studio visits, and our studio visits averaged 3 hours. And so we went into this with a very specific intention, which was lots of our friends have not liked being in the Whitney Biennial. Many of my really close friends have been in the show. They said it wasn't a great experience. And it's not because I think the curators did anything wrong. I think it's a really hard show to show up and be caring for artists in the process of making work. It's also really hard when you're having artists that, let's say you have one artist who's being fully funded through a gallery versus artists who are not getting funding because they don't have a gallery. And so Chrissie and I really thought how we wanted to approach this, and this is the artist list that we came up with for 2024. For us, we decided that even though there's about 71 artists in total of what you're seeing, there's only 41, 42 in the gallery space. So we kind of determined like we could each handle managing 20 artists maybe. Like 20 is a lot. And that meant that each of us was like hands-on with those practices. You know, we both were meeting with people, but it meant you were in conversations with artists, you were making sure their work was, you know, coming together, they had the support that they need. Did artists were they fully funded behind things that when they didn't have a gallery? All of those types of things are like to be negotiated, and it's not very clear to an artist like when they enter the space of like what they're going to get. And so for us, we really wanted to have some clarity with the artists. And we also kind of realized that we wanted to make an exhibition for ourselves, the artists that we were working with. I kind of set forward a goal to not work with anyone I had worked with before. So I didn't want to bring in any artists that I had worked with, which is not typical. I think part of it is I just wanted to meet new artists and try new things. That didn't happen. One artist I've worked with, Carolyn Lazard, doesn't wind up in the show. And so really giving yourself some guidelines, we just made the show on the road. And I often described it as like being on a speeding train and attempting to like put a narrative together, because you're really in just like a lot of Lyfts and Ubers and taxis and trying to figure out how do artists relate to each other. And you know, our studio visits, for anyone that did a studio visit with me, you know I can kind of talk forever. And so I love talking around work. I love getting to know an artist before we really get into the work. I really want to get a sense of like, what are you reading? What are you interested in? What are the things that are influencing your practice? Who are you as a person? Like, we're going to be collaborating for at least a year. Like, do we like each other? And that doesn't mean I don't work with artists I don't like. It just means that I want to get a little bit of getting to know you first before we really get into like what work is. And sometimes with the Biennial, because of the scale, you're doing 45-minute quick studio visits of just like, what do you have in your studio? And you keep going. And so some of our studio visits were 12 hours. Those were with artists that were very important to us in the show, and that we felt like we had to show up and give a lot of respect to. And some of them were, you know, a couple of them were like an hour, hour and a half, depending on like how the artist was kind of up for and feeling it. But our show was really grounded by a group of who I would say are matriarchs to our show. It was Pippa Garner, who recently passed away, Mary Kelly, Harmony Hammond, Suzanne Jackson, I'm going to blank on Mavis Puzzi, and Takako Yamaguchi. So those are 7 artists, all in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so we were really wanting to bring in, and it wasn't something we thought to begin with. We just started meeting with these older women, and we're like, they're just making amazing work. They're inspiring so many of these artists, and all of them were showing, other than Mavis Puzzi, whose work is directly behind Charisse here, all of them are alive. Well, Pippa recently passed. All of them are making current work. Suzanne Jackson just opened a major show at SF MoMA. Takako just had a big show at MoCA. And so for us, we really wanted to bring in people who we thought had been overlooked. In the end of our groupings, of the 70 some odd artists in the show, only 3 of them have been in the show before. So we also really wanted to bring in people who had never been in the exhibition. And then we found out this kind of stat, which is not something Chrissie and I thought about, but I guess we got critiqued for a quarter of them being connected to like Ivy Leagues, and Colleen Smith was like, doesn't that mean 75% are not? And so we had like 75% of artists who were not connected to like Yale, Columbia, the big programs. And I would just say in general, I don't care about CVs. I don't really care where people went to school. I just want to really look at the work and kind of talk to people. And so we built an exhibition. It was the 81st edition of the longest running contemporary art in the United States, a survey, 71 artists in total and collectives. And I'm going to read just our exhibition text to you. Collectives grappling with many of today's most pressing issues. The Biennial is like being inside a dissonant chorus is one of the things that we were thinking about, which was described by Lihia Lewis, who's an amazing choreographer and artist. We say a provocative yet intimate experience of distinct and disparate voices that collectively probe the cracks and fissures of the unfolding moment. The exhibition's subtitle, which was even better than the real thing, acknowledges that artificial intelligence is complicating our understanding of what is real, and the rhetoric around gender and authenticity is being used politically and legally to perpetuate transphobia and restrict bodily autonomy. These developments are part of a long history of deeming people and marginalized race, gender, and ability as subhuman, less than real. in making this exhibition, we committed to amplifying the voices of artists who are confronting these legacies and to providing space where difficult ideas can be engaged and considered. And so for us, we just had a really straightforward premise. Like, we wanted to bring in people who hadn't been in the show before. I guess we didn't have that many like cis dudes in the show, which we got critiqued on quite a bit. But I think a lot of it was kind of tracing some of these legacies and really thinking about, again, these matriarchs as anchoring aspects of the show. And I think for me, it was really interesting during the process of talking about the show. I would be on radio shows or I'd be having conversations and I would talk about this idea of like the subhuman, what it has meant in America for there not to be people considered as real. And I'd have people just be like, you're lying, that's not true. And I'm just like, what world are we living in right now? Like, we're so separate from each other. It's so hard to be able to communicate with each other. And a lot of the artists that we worked with were using these strategies of opacity. And so as much as the artists in our show were like very much interested in legacies of queerness, transness, and I would just say even just like queer theory, post-structuralist thought, they also are really cautious about ideas of representation and how one images a body in a space and what it means to be seen in a space. And so that was kind of a consistent kind of tension that we were really thinking about. And so this next work I'm showing is, you know, just an amazing artist to be able to work with. Isaac Julien, who, if you're not familiar with his practice and you have not seen Looking for Langston, is just a really, really important filmmaker. He's British. He's, oddly enough, had never been in the Whitney Biennial. But one of the things that Chrissie and I set forth, because we're known as moving image curators, we knew we had to bring it when it came to video. And so we had about 6 or 7 really robust video installations, including Isaac Julien. So this is a shot inside, which is using reflective mirrors across a film work that's looking to the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia and thinking about their history of collecting African objects. And so this idea of the real becomes quite loose throughout the show. It isn't just this sense that I think a lot of people thought our show would be about AI. There's like almost no AI in the show. I love kind of the bait and switch of like color people time is not about color people time. You know, speech acts isn't about speech act theory. It's like we're taking these things and we're sort of twisting them in a certain way. And so a lot of this around Isaac Julien's work is thinking about this idea of authenticity and who has authority over an object, and becomes this full conversation between a Black Renaissance scholar, Elaine Locke, in relationship to Albert Barnes, a white collector, and who has the real authority over the work. And so we're playing out some of those tensions within space. The previous exhibition for us, and really quick, Tanaz, it's 45. How am I doing time-wise? I have time, go. The previous show really had a lot of abstraction within the show via the sight lines. And just to say, like, the show is massive. This floor you're seeing right here is 13,000 square feet. Another floor is 18,000 square feet. Like, these are giant spaces. And for us, we really wanted to give lots of room to artists. Anyone that saw the show has seen photos of the show. Sometimes the Whitney Biennial, you get in the show and you've wanted to be in it and you get to hang 1 or 2 paintings. And so for Chrissie and I, we just thought, let's give artists space to really do their installations. This is B. Ingrid Olsen, who's thinking a lot about her own body as it's being imaged in her own photography. And as you're seeing some of the installation, it's actually architectural remnants and creations of her body being pressed into form. And this is unlike any installation Ingrid has ever done before, but she modeled it out. She was really playing in response to KRM Mooney, who was across the way. They didn't know each other, but they knew each other through Instagram and liked each other's work. And so Ingrid came in and laid it out and was like, I can't wait to see what Mooney's gonna do. It was like that kind of energy between artists of just being like, I can't wait to see what this person's gonna do. I'm really curious, like, I'm in the same room as Harmony Hammond, who's an icon, you know. You really have that sense. And one of the reasons I wanted to show this image too is because it's a lot bigger here, let me see. You can see the yellow room is P. Staff, who's a fantastic artist. And P. Staff started this floor with an electric net hanging above you called afferent nerves. P's work is often thinking about ideas of transness and contamination, and they work with this kind of like acidic yellow, but our show started with an electrified net that hung over the audience. And so we had to do a lot of talks with our legal team about like whether people got shocked or not. And so we had to equate for like basketball players jumping and all this kind of stuff. But like in the end, we wanted this real sense of danger that comes out in the show, and maybe something that I didn't quite say in Charlize Perlina Wesson's work that you're seeing here. We really wanted people to feel unsafe in the space. Like that felt really important to us. And it was interesting when people were like, oh, I don't feel unsafe in this space. And I was like, good for you. Like people feel unsafe all the time in all of these spaces. And so what did it mean to be in the Whitney that felt as if literally you were like falling in the space? So this work from Charlize Perlina Wesson is actually 7 architectural planes of glass that are being hung over the audience. And the people who installed it are called Lift My Glass. They're kind of amazing to watch them install. But when you walk underneath it, it feels as if a building is falling on top of you. And so we really wanted to have these moments that had people feeling as if they were disoriented or they weren't quite sure exactly where they were. And so I point to this image just to show you also the sight line between Ingrid Olsen, P staff of the light seeping in, this real sense of the yellow, all the way down to Carmen Wynant, who's a really important photographer. And Carmen did this beautiful installation called The Last Safe Abortion that images abortion workers over the past 50 years. We good? You good? Cool. And showing you some images of intergenerational hangs. You know, this was really important for us. I always called this show a back to basics show. How do you tell a story? What is your exhibition about? Like, I believe in clarity. I do not believe in curatorial language that makes something confusing. If I come to an exhibition and I don't understand what it is, we're in trouble. I'm a professional. I do this for a living. And if I can't understand it, what does it mean for other people to enter into the space? And so I really I'm interested in ideas in theory, and I try to explain them in really plain language. And so to me, if you can't, maybe we don't actually grasp what the full theory is at that time. And so when it came to the show, I just really thought, how do you tell a story and how do you hang artwork? And so I really have this belief as a curator, like without the ideas, without the support of artists, you should be able to make things look good. Like, I really think it's important to be able to shepherd and work with an artist to think about how you occupy space. And oftentimes younger artists just think, oh, I'll just show up with my work and I'm gonna hang it in this space. Well, this space where we're hanging, it's a fully open box that's custom designed for the show. 17-foot ceilings, you know, it's all of these things are really, really particular. And trying to talk with artists and really think through how those works are best situated. And so what you're seeing at the very front is Karen Olivier, this amazing salt cast rope. So what you're seeing hanging looks like marble. That's actually cast from salt with a little bit of epoxy, which is holding buoys. Where we're kind of viewing is actually totally blank walls. And so a classical hang is to have a sculpture in front of totally blank white walls. And so oftentimes in a biennial, you would have other artists there obstructing the view. And so we really wanted to think about that cast line in relationship to one of our elders in the show, Takako Yamaguchi, who makes these really beautiful seascapes. She's actually trained as a photorealist painter. And when I asked Takako why she doesn't paint those anymore, she says she wants to finish a painting before she dies. And it is like, I'm gonna just be out here making these paintings. She's fantastic. I really recommend seeing her work. Okay, I gotta keep it moving here. But one of the things I also wanna say is just like when you're working on a show like this, what it means to also kind of give thanks to other curators. We brought in lots of works that were installed in other shows. And I would say, of the 42 pieces, maybe 20 of them were brand new and 20 of them were not. And some of that came from, you know, artists saying, hey, I just had a kid, I can't make a new piece. Totally fine, we'll find some work that's existing that makes sense within this. Lotus King did this amazing installation called In Cascades, and what you're seeing is actually film that has been exposed to UV light. She tans these, and they're hanging from this kind of super strut system, so it creates this reference to Korean homes, and you have this tatami mat, which is laying down on the floor. And so she's thinking a lot about the body and architecture, as well as relationship to photography. And so we really wanted this sense of impermanence that happens, from material that was impermanent to artists who are dealing with it as a subject matter. And maybe one of the artists that really took this on, because you kind of section it. I'm not giving you guys like full sections of the show. I'm just giving you kind of snippets of it. This is from the artist Eddie Rodolfo Aparicio, and this is a work that he made casting tree amber. So it's all tree resin that has been cast in his studio in Los Angeles. And over the course of the show, which was not very long, actually it was only like the first 3 weeks, the amber would move towards the light and warp. And so it began moving towards the light of the windows, and you could see different aspects of transparency between this work and these archives that were hidden within. It's never, a lot of it was actually really opaque. You could never really quite see what was fully in there. And in the list of materials, there were things like a dead pigeon and pants and things like that that maybe you never even saw. And after a few weeks, the work totally collapsed on itself. So it began kind of, and it was built to collapse on itself. And so you're seeing a steel structure that was there to really hold this piece together. And so for us, we really wanted to kind of think about how could artists go big? What are these connections to exhibitions that we were excited about in Whitney history? And also like, how do you support an artist in trying to make something that also in the end you couldn't collect, I think was something that I was really interested in. I've totally veered here, and I'm trying to catch up time-wise. But I do just want to also point to really quick kind of scale of this show. This is a work from Turquoise Dyson. This piece was fully commissioned for our M&O terrace. I'd never installed anything outdoors before. You're dealing with 25-mile-per-hour winds. It was 6 weeks of install through rain, sleet, snow. We have an amazing team, and I work at a museum that has 425 people who are dedicated to making these projects happen. And so we had an entire team dedicated to building this like outdoors with Turquoise. And so really just thinking again about like, how do you help artists realize the projects that they're interested in? And Turquoise, when we approached her, although she makes works sculpturally, she's also known as a painter. And so she thought, oh, you're just gonna take a couple of my paintings. And we were like, no, we're gonna give you this award and you're gonna use this money to actually build this like giant work outdoors that really kind of changed what her practice could be, and is a really thoughtful artist. And so, for me, it's really having this methodology of like, how do you work with artists and how do you help them realize the projects that they have? And I'd say I'm really interested in being deeply collaborative with them, and also hopefully understanding your space where you can help them maximize the things that they're doing while also creating narratives that are hopefully not reductive to their practices. And so it's consistently a challenge, and it's a challenge when you're working at a larger institution and figuring out like word count, figuring out, reading, let's say, oftentimes in museums, you're trying to read for a 7th grade, reader is often the place that you're trying to write your text to. And that seems low, but you also start realizing that there's a lot of non-English speakers coming through our museum and really thinking about English as a second language. And so all of this stuff ends up becoming this kind of like huge collaboration, not simply with the artists, but with the team of the museum of access workers and things like that you're working with. I'm going to end on like 2 slightly different notes, which is just to say that everything I do is also in book form. And so I'm a really huge proponent of having catalogs. And I just want to say I actually work with the same designers on all of my books. And so I've worked with them for the past 9 years. It's a group called Studio Ella. They did our Speech Acts book, Colored People Time, our Whitney Biennial. Here's the Ulysses Jenkins catalog. And then last week we just released a new book that I did with graduate students at Cornell on Mary Shelley's The Last Man. And so again, thinking about, collaborating with people long-term, being part of that kind of long journey, and something I'm really interested in. And even though when I want to work with new artists, I then think about how do I continue to work with them, beyond this exhibition. Sometimes it's bringing in their work into a collection. Sometimes it's showing up at openings or writing something about them. And so for me, it's really thinking in that kind of like community sense And I don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but I just want to say I'm working on a totally different project than I've ever worked on before. And so I'm doing this really weird Roy Lichtenstein exhibition right now. Roy Lichtenstein, everyone knows. He gifted a major gift to the Whitney, and I'm co-curating this with the artist Alex DeCorte. And so we're attempting to make a Roy Lichtenstein kind of thematic show that thinks about ideas of repetition and what I think of as like image motility. Like, how did Roy, who was always appropriating images, so he's thinking about the decontextualized image from its source, how did that predate where we are today and how we think about images? Images divorced from history, images divorced from artists, images divorced from its original intentionality. And so we're not moving forward with this. This is like a sketch that won't happen, but this was kind of an initial sketch that we did with one of our architects. We have 3 architects on staff, and so we get to try out plans of how do you layer things? How do you make sure this work feels as if it's not simply stuck in the 1950s and 1960s? That show opens in a year, and I'm sure I'll lecture about it at some other point, but I just wanted to give a sneak preview to that. But yeah, thank you guys for listening to me talk, and I appreciate it. Could you just speak a little louder?
Yeah, okay,
I heard most of it.
okay. I say thank you for this talk.
Thank you.
And since you are coming from a really important place in America,
So, can you hear me? Yeah, I can hear myself as well. So, yeah. After thank you again, that's my question is that since you're working in a the most important city for art scene, the contemporary art scene today, I was wondering that how much is, since you said that you are working with like different artists with sometimes without considering their CV, and sometimes you are like, it's like a challenge for yourself to like work with different types of artwork, even those artists who you never worked with them before. So my question is that how much is important for artists or even curators in the art scene today that they categorize themselves, like find a title for themselves or be a subtitle of a categorized group, like people you easily can refer to the categories of working, like people who thinking about like feminists idea or other kind of categories.
I mean, I think it's hard for artists to like divorce themselves from the histories that they're speaking back to. And I would say one of the most important things to me when I'm working with an artist is if an artist isn't aware of art historical precedents, we're probably not going to work together. Like, I think that is something that's a really quick, and that doesn't mean I think every artist needs to know art history really well. It's just when you start talking to artists and they're, not familiar with, let's say, how their work relates to 1960s minimalism. That doesn't mean you have to be on top of the current scene. I'm not saying you have to know everyone today, but let's say we're talking about feminist practices and you're like, I've never heard of Mary Kelly. Well, we're in trouble. Like, I just feel like there needs to be a place of like understanding what you're responding to and how you're moving things together, moving things forward. But I also like, I just don't personally find, I said this earlier and I can't remember who it was to, like, I don't read artist statements. It's not like, I actually think artist statements and CVs and all of that stuff is actually for the space you guys are currently in, academia. Like, I think it's for tenure, I think it's for all of that stuff. Like, I never look at work and say, what's their CV? Where did that person go to school? Like, I think what schooling does for you is create a network of artists that you are then in conversation with. And so as you notice from my presentation, like, I went to school with a lot of the people that I worked with, and I don't think about it as nepotism. It's the artists I'm rooted in a community with and I'm supporting. And so I think for me, that's not to say like, screw school in any type of way, but like the things that you're gonna worry about right now are not the things you're gonna worry about when you're out in the same type of way. And that's not to say applying for grants, all of those things, CVs, artist statements become incredibly important. But for me as a curator, it's not something I really look to. And then in regards to like branding yourself, I think there's a place of like understanding your precedents versus like branding yourself as a style of artist. Like I find myself pretty repulsed by that. And so I'm not really like interested in, you know, I don't form shows. I don't know if I'd form a show being like, this is a feminist art historical show. I'm more interested in like the niches of those places, or like how those things kind of have a dialogue. And maybe I'm thinking about feminism, but my feminism might be coming about from a conversation I had with Mary Kelly. Like Mary Kelly could say something that really spurred something for me. So to me, it's actually really about being in dialogue with the artist. Of course, thank you. Do you mind passing it to the person in green behind you? And then you got another person in green behind you.
I'm terrified of microphones because I'm a very loud person. So you said a couple times you don't ever want to reduce an artist's practice.
Yeah.
I want to know more about what that means to you, especially because it seems to me that it's impossible to entirely avoid, especially in something like the Biennial that is all of these artists coming together and they only really get to present a small facet of what they do.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess I think of reducing isn't actually about the scale in which an artist is showing their work. I also, let me just say, like, I can want something that fails all the time. Like, my sense for me, like, let's say with speech acts, it's not the sense of like a monolith. And I think because I come from like a very queer and Black perspective, like I'm inherently allergic to like the idea of a monolith. And I think it's really important, especially today where we're at, to think about the intricacies and differences instead of thinking about groups of people in one type of way, even when we don't agree with them. A lot of mine comes down to something I think about, which is how does one frame something? And so one of the things I found deeply challenging, and I actually think we failed in the Biennial, is I think our labels were not great. And I think our labels failed because for the Biennial, when you're writing labels, you're talking to the artist, you're getting a full interview with them about what the work is. I'm then translating what I think this work is about. It then goes to our education team who works on it. Like 8 people work on these labels. And I could look at the work of, let's say, this isn't the case, but let's say Turquoise Dyson is like, my work is about, she thinks about Black extraction in relationship to architecture. If I believe the work is doing something different, it doesn't mean I get to write the work is different. It actually means I do the thing that Turquoise says. And so I think sometimes in smaller group shows, you can have those ideas of making and unmaking together. But when you're doing a big show like this, you kind of have to do what the artist says and how they want their work framed and talked about. And sometimes artists are choosing that based off of the market. You know, some people say, oh, my work is about, you know, let's just use a term like Black radical imagination or the Black radical tradition. And it's like, what does that mean? Like, what does that mean right now? What happens when everything becomes a hashtag? It's like you have to kind of come back and think about the granular. But when you're working on a scale like this, it's not like I can just call up an artist and say, hey, let's really think about this. My best friend Caro, who was in the show, it was like total warfare between both of us in the labels. We were both just like not agreeing with each other. And when I toured that work, sometimes I just would be like, I don't know if I get that work. Like, I also don't understand every art object I work with. And sometimes I don't understand it, and maybe I do later, maybe I don't. And so I think there's also this place of like, especially in a place now in which the art I'm interested in is about form and conceptual thought. You know, these are two things coming together. What does it mean? I think Eddie really had some questions around like, was his work actually fully resolved by the time he showed it? He was like, I don't know if I have the full concept down. And I was like, who cares? Like, it doesn't have to be resolved the moment you show it. I think it needs to be resolved for you to continue to move forward and make things. And so there's a long answer to it, but I just think these things get really complicated. And I think one of the greatest complications, and something I talk to my wife a lot about, who is a philosopher and writes books, and like is the limitation of word count in my field. Like a label right now at the museum is 75 words. What do you say with 75 words? 200 words for the intro text of the show. Like, what can you say with 200 words? You have to say so many things within that. And so there's a lot of tension that kind of arises within it.
You're in green.
say, what did you say?
We got two
in
more.
green. I thought you said you're angry. I was like, what? Thanks so much. That was really a great talk. I'm so happy I was able to be here and hear it. I have two maybe related questions. The first one was I really appreciated, kind of these moments you described behind the scenes, like when the one artist is kind of interacting with the other artist that's through the room. So I was curious to hear more about, and you spoke also a lot about your own kind of commitment to collaborative relationships, long-term relationships, dialogue. I'm curious to hear a little bit about how, if and how, you kind of planned into the Whitney Biennial, but it could be other exhibitions too, opportunities for the artists beyond their works being in the same spaces together, for the artists to kind of be in conversation with one another.
Yeah.
Whether in a straightforward way through programming or otherwise. And then maybe related to that, and it's a scale question, when you speak about this kind of, commitment to long-term relationships with this pretty large community of artists and other curators that you're kind of part of and that you're building, do you feel like there's a critical mass, well, not a critical mass, a kind of limit in terms of scale to sort of how many artists you can sort of have that kind of relationship with, like a reciprocal kind of, to how much energy or time that you have capacity for? Like the example of we each picked 20 artists to be in the space because we could only handle that much, but just hearing you speak about all of these shows you're working on, maybe that question of capacity.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's I'll answer the capacity and then go backwards. It's totally hard. Like last week I flew to San Francisco to celebrate Suzanne Jackson, and part of it was because this past year my grandmother passed away, and it made me realize that the matriarchs in the show, I just wanted to spend more time with them, and Pippa Garner had passed before I had some time with her, and so earlier in the year I went out and saw Harmony Hammond. I'm going to go see, I just saw Takako Yamaguchi. Like, I just wanted to spend more time with these people that I'm also, I don't know if it came across, like I'm totally obsessed with them. Like Mary Kelly, like Takako is one of the coolest dressers out there, and anytime we see each other, we're both like, what are you wearing? I really genuinely like spending time with them. Not every artist I'm going to be like kicking it with. Like, sometimes we don't relate in that type of way. I think careers take us in different places. Our lives take us in different places. And then there's all these different sweet ways that you have a chance to like spend time with people. Like Carmen Wyant, I just adore. And Carmen brought me out to her university to give a talk, and I asked her to write for our catalog. Lotus King is an amazing dresser as well, and so we just text each other what we're buying on Essence. There's just things of like, it's not always big. Sometimes it's just the like, hey, like thinking of you doing this. I mean, Chrissie and I are like sisters now. Like, you both are checking in on each other in these like really intense ways, but I think some of it is trying to have intention. It also gets so big, like Carolyn Lazard, an artist I'm really close with. I didn't go out and see their show recently. We were just texting each other this morning being like, man, we haven't talked in a minute. Like, I have the intention, but it's not always there. And I think it's also, the thing I've realized is the more my career has developed, the more I need people who understand like the demands on my time. And so like, that's a really big part of it, but the intention's there. And then you were saying about bringing artists together. So something I didn't have a chance to talk about, which was really important to the show. I have like 5 minutes left. Okay. So something that's really important, and I know there's one more question, but can I just talk to you after the talk? Cool. So yes, 2 things about that. So maybe 3 things. One, we arranged the floor plans knowing who artists loved. And so there are moments where you were like, oh, so for instance, I did not know this, but like Nikita Gale was in the show. And Nikita had studied with Mary Kelly on the same floor. In the end, Mary Kelly's piece had Nikita Gale's MFA meeting in her diary that was shown on the wall. We had no idea. Nikita was then next to P. Staff, their best friend in the show. And so they actually were in dialogue, but we never framed it as best friends being in the show. Ingrid, I knew, was a huge fan of Suzanne Jackson and Harmony. So we actually laid the floor plan out knowing who a lot of the younger artists really looked up to. We also had a artist only opening where they all got a chance to like meet each other. But the most important aspect of the show that I don't have an image of is The 3 artists that return into the show for the first time, the 3 artists who returned to the Biennial, were very purposely curated together, and we told it socially, like through tours, but we never had a label because we didn't want to over-determine their practices. So the 3 artists who had been in a Biennial before were Carolyn Lazard, they were in the 2019 Biennial, Sharon Hayes, who was in Chrissie's 2006, and Mary Kelly, who was in 1991. And the reason we wanted to bring them back was to trace a pedagogical lineage between Mary Kelly, who taught Sharon Hayes, and Sharon Hayes, who taught Carolyn Lazard. And so we ended up having this really beautiful room between intergenerational dialogue, and we brought them all together to actually be in conversation. And none of them said, oh, we kind of knew what some of them were making, but Mary Kelly was like, I'm starting to make my final body of work, and it was just so moving. And Sharon Hayes made a piece about queer and trans elders across the United States telling their life stories and talking about their sex drives in their 70s. And like, it just was this like real, like I cried, like everyone cried who came in and saw the piece. So there were like these really purposeful moments that we had, but again, it becomes those like, these are friends, or they're in this show for this reason. And it's like audiences, I have faith in audiences, but I also am kind of like, sometimes you can't tell people every secret that's in a show because they'll just think, oh, that artist is there for that type of reason. But I do believe in that kind of like connective tissue that sort of holds things together. And sometimes when you're in a room and you're like, how do these 2 artists vibe so well? Well, maybe it's because they're actually in each other's studio all the time talking with each other. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.